Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Kulma. I'm the head of Programs and Communications here at International House. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program on human rights and democracy in East Asia, hosted by International House as part of our Global Voices Lecture Series program. From the day International House opened its doors over 91 years ago, we've been dedicated to the promotion of understanding and fellowship among the peoples of all nations. We're focused on promoting cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among international students, scholars, and the community. That mission is made manifest through programs like tonight's, and that mission guides the work of the 15 other international houses around the world. I invite you to explore more of our upcoming programs on our website and social media platforms to stay engaged with our diverse range of events. As we gather here today, the global dialogue on human rights and democracy is a very front and center issue. Tonight, we'll delve into one particular geographic region of that conversation, East Asia, particularly North Korea, and we'll do that in the context of the U.S. commitment to human rights and democracy in that region. Our discussion today will shed light on the complexities and challenges faced in promoting these values in the region, and by extension, to the broader world. As someone who's been engaged in and studied this region and this issues for over 20 years, I've been really looking forward to tonight's conversation. To help navigate the complexities of that conversation, we're delighted to have with us tonight Ambassador Julie Turner, the Special Envoy on North Korean human rights issues at the U.S. Department of State, joined in conversation by Carl Friedhoff from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Now, before we jump into this dialogue, a few quick thank yous. Thank you, of course, to the iHouse team who has helped us to put this together, our partners, the Center for East Asian Studies, the Posen Family Center for Human Rights, and the Asia Policy Forum. I want to thank all of you, of course, for coming, and a special thank you, of course, to Ambassador Turner and to Carl. Now, for a more proper introduction of our speakers, I'd like to turn the podium over to Levi Latos. Levi is an MPP student at the Harris School of Public Policy here at the University of Chicago. Levi was instrumental in making this program happen, having had an internship at the State Department last summer, and he and his colleagues from Harris have been an absolute pleasure to work with. Levi, over to you.
Hello, my name is Levi Latos. I am a second-year student at the Harris School of Public Policy here at the University of Chicago, and I'm honored to introduce our speakers for tonight's event. I first learned of the ambassador's work while interning at the State Department, and while I didn't work directly with her, I was excited to learn of her extensive career in the civil service, a path I too plan to take after graduating. Ambassador Julie Turner was sworn in as the U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues on October 13th of last year. Ambassador Turner is globally recognized as an expert in human rights and democracy and has worked over the past 20 years to strengthen democratic institutions and promote human rights throughout East Asia and the Pacific region. Most recently, she served as the Office Director in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State, and has previously served as the Director for Southeast Asia at the National Security Council. Ambassador Turner will be joined by Mr. Carl Friedhoff during tonight's event. Mr. Friedhoff is the Marshall M. Bhutan Fellow for Asia Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Prior to his work at the Council, Mr. Friedhoff was based in Seoul, where he was a program officer in the Public Opinion Studies program at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. His work has appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among others, and he has been a frequent guest on both TV and radio to discuss U.S. foreign policy in Asia, South Korean politics, and international relations in East Asia. Please join me as we welcome Ambassador Julie Turner and Mr. Carl Friedhoff.
Well, thanks for everyone for joining us, Michael, and thank you for the kind introductions. Before we kick off, I've been pointed out to remind everyone that there is indeed a microphone, I think, in the back. So as this discussion is ongoing, if you have a question, please hold on to it, and we'll circle back at the end with about 30 minutes left to bring the audience into this as well. Ambassador Turner, thank you for joining us in Chicago. And I know we're here initially to talk about kind of democracy, but with a focus on human rights in North Korea. But first, I want to take a step back and kind of zoom out and look at the region more broadly. I think there was a time 15 to 20 years ago where there was a feeling that eventually there was going to be democratization and economic opening in the region more broadly. That if you looked at this, it looked like the arc of history was bending more towards the United States than it was towards places like China and North Korea. I think it's fair to say over the 15 years, and especially over the past 15 years, and especially the past 10, from North Korea's perspective, I get the feeling that they see the arc of history now bending more towards them in the region. It's not just China and Russia. Obviously, if you look in Southeast Asia, which you're familiar with, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, now what's happening in Myanmar, all taking an authoritarian and sometimes promoting a line of succession among families. So first, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the state of the region, whether you agree that this is whether or not you agree if maybe North Korea sees it in that way, that the world is starting to look more like them rather than less, and how does the United States go about counteracting that?
It's a great question to kick off the conversation, one that is no easy task to tackle, but I will do my best. I think without a doubt, we've seen a rise in authoritarianism, and many of us have been talking or writing or thinking about this trend for the last few years. I tend to think of it less as a leaning or curving towards the US or curving towards the PRC, and more a turn away from the people. And I think that largely we see this trend because of authoritarian leaders who have been slowly chipping away at civic space. Now we are in an environment where civil society groups can't thrive in the same way that they could a decade ago. I think we were perhaps complacent at a period when those groups were growing and thriving. And then we saw, especially in East Asia, laws like China's foreign NGO law go into place. We similarly have seen laws being pursued by the Cambodian government. Many of the other Southeast Asian, ASEAN member states have pursued similar laws. And with that comes a restriction on freedom of expression. It also creates an environment that lacks transparency and kind of allows corruption to fester. And governments are no longer held accountable to the people. And that is absolutely a worrying trend. I mean, in my day-to-day activity in the North Korea human rights space, this is extremely worrying because now we also see partnerships between many of those governments exchanging surveillance technology, which tightens controls, increases self-censorship, and just fear amongst the population. We see a rise in transnational repression, which is when a government reaches beyond its territorial boundaries to repress the rights of individuals. We've seen the PRC doing that here in the United States, and the US Department of Justice has taken a number of actions to counter that activity here in the US. But in the North Korea space, the North Koreans have been, the North Koreans have been kind of on the cutting edge, if you will, of transnational repression for decades, with the international abductions of Japanese nationals as well as nationals from other countries, as well as the infamous Sony hack from a few years ago, and then extending to the Kim Jong-nam assassination that happened in Malaysia. And so these kind of trends where authoritarians are sharing tools and tactics is very worrying.
So continuing on in the region, we talked a little bit about the state of democracy. This is obviously a big election year. It's not only the U.S. There are, I think, 50 elections around the world this year. More than half of the population is going to vote. We've already seen elections in South Korea, by-elections in Japan. Indonesia had an election, and India is coming up. What is the role of the United States in promoting democracy in the region? How does it pull in its partners to do that? Is there a role for alliances? Obviously, the Biden administration has focused a lot on alliances, mostly on the security side of this. But in terms of pulling alliances in to focus on democracy and how we promote that and build a stronger network, so then you can then use that influence to then turn it on North Korea. Turn it on North Korea is a little bit of the wrong phrase, but then use that to achieve goals that the U.S. is trying to achieve.
Yes, absolutely. In terms of building upon pre-existing partnerships and alliances, we recently hosted the Japanese government for an official visit. We have, during the Biden administration, also hosted the Yoon administration for a state visit, and had numerous other both state visits, but also efforts that we've undertaken to upgrade relationships. We have an expanded partnership with ASEAN now. We also have an upgraded relationship with Vietnam now. And so we're not just relying on the old partnerships, but also trying to build trust and confidence through expansion of new partnerships. And I think that the partnership with Vietnam and ASEAN are two perfect examples of that. In terms of election years and how we support democratic processes, I think one, it is support to civil society, because they are at the core, the ones who are going to lead the way in building democratic institutions domestically in their home countries. Also, empowering and supporting independent press, so that these countries can have an informed citizenry, because informed citizenries are able to better engage with their governments, and to really demand responsive governments, which at the end of the day is what we're hoping to see more of. And that increases peace, stability, security across the region.
So I'll pick up on two things there. You mentioned civil society and independent press, two things which obviously are very limited in North Korea. Is there a way to promote those inside of North Korea? Are there attempts to do that, or is at this point, is there more harm to be done in doing that because you put people at risk as you try to reach them and have them become more active in North Korea?
So I think right now it's very clear that there's a demand for independent information in North Korea. And I think that we can see that demand in the North Korean government's recent actions, because they've been tightening control of the information space. Human Rights Watch put out a report a couple of months ago about backsliding in North Korea's human rights situation during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're talking about one of the worst human rights crises in the world, and it got worse. The unimaginable happened. And the way I've interpreted their report is that COVID was the worst thing that could have happened to the North Korean people, but the best thing that could have happened to the North Korean government, because it allowed for this tightening of repression. They put into place 3 new laws that increased penalties for viewing foreign media. We've seen them enforcing those laws. They put into place a shoot-to-kill order. So without a doubt, there is real fear on the North Korean government side of this external flow of independent information. I think from our side, one of the areas that the U.S. government has prioritized for many years through news outlets like Radio Free Asia, Voice of America, but also supporting independent refugee and defector-led groups that are based in Seoul, is to just increase the amount of information that's out there. And then it's really up to the end user to decide whether or not they want to take the risk to take it. We don't want to inadvertently put somebody at risk by pushing information into the hands of an unwitting end user. But there is enough of a demand signal domestically that people are still looking for ways to get their hands on K-dramas or K-pop.
Then how is that demand signal being met? Is this through, we often see, I think what gathers the most headlines is balloons being flown in from south of the border, although the South Korean government has gone back and forth on whether or not it's going to allow that. So is this USB sticks being delivered in that way, being kind of flown in, or are they coming in through China? How is that independent information getting in?
So my answer is a little bit different today than it was pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, there were lots of different channels for getting information in. There was radio broadcasting. There are the groups based in South Korea that do the balloon launches, that do water bottle launches into the sea. And there were always the informal networks being run out of the black markets, the Jangnagang, and people were exchanging USB drives there. From what I've heard from recent defectors, kids were sharing those with one another, and it was quite an open thing at the time. In fact, some of them would gather in small groups to watch them. But since COVID, especially in the last year, that stopped. The penalties, the number of public executions is up in the last year, and people aren't willing to take that risk anymore. So some of the technology that we've been relying on is no longer usable today. And so one, we need to think about reinvesting in some of the old school technology, and that is the radio broadcasts that are tried and true. But two, also, and this is part of the reason why I'm engaging with student groups now, is to think beyond just the advocacy work, but also like innovation and entrepreneurism here in creating new technology that can help increase that free flow of information to North Koreans.
So to pick up on the backsliding piece of human rights there, and you touched on this a little bit with the orders to shoot people who are potentially viewing South Korean dramas, and I think we see the headlines about that, whether it's from the BBC or elsewhere. But sometimes it feels like also that catches a lot of headlines and it catches a lot of attention, which is good, but it also skips over, I think, some of the underlying human rights, kind of the lived experience of people on the ground. Could you touch on that lived experience in terms of food security, freedom of movement, healthcare, kind of a broad-ranging view of the lived experience?
Yeah, I think somebody asked me earlier today to describe the kind of priority areas in the North Korean human rights work. What are the priority issues? It's so hard to identify those in the North Korean context because the human rights problems are so wide-ranging. We're talking about a country where there are summary executions, disappearances and arbitrary detention are commonplace. Starvation is absolutely commonplace, and while the reports on food security are mixed right now, we are seeing absolutely an effort by the government to re-centralize the public distribution system. And so over the last decade, kind of a rising middle class has started to appear in North Korea. But now, once the public redistribution system is put into place, then you end up in a situation where the government controls when and who gets their rations at any given moment in time. And so the people that were able to build a certain amount of wealth pre-COVID may soon see that security, that food security that they've been able to establish for themselves disappear. With all that said, I don't want to sound, the situation is quite dire, but I also want to point to areas where there are opportunity. And I think we've seen that in the disability rights space. Pre-COVID, the North Koreans did sign the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities In 2017, they invited the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities to visit North Korea. It's the only UN special procedure that they have engaged with. And they have continued, even as recently as last year, to talk about reforming national laws to better reflect the rights that are enshrined in the CRPD. And so that may offer an area of opportunity, is thinking about the disability rights space as a potential first step in tackling the human rights situation in North Korea.
So on this rising middle class, I think that's an intriguing idea to think about, that there is this rising middle class there. Can you talk about where it is in North Korea? Is this a regional focus? Is it all Pyongyang, or is this also emanating out into the outer regions, that there's a rising middle class there?
So I should clarify, I think that rising middle class existed,
Okay.
but is quickly being squashed. And I, particularly in recent months, the last time I was in Seoul, I had the opportunity to go to Hanwon and met with a couple of the groups that had come by sea directly from North Korea to the south in last year. When I asked some of the younger generation, teenagers, I guess, amongst the group, they all told me food security was never an issue for them. Now, granted, these were people from southern part of the country who lived close to the ports, and so there probably was a lot more trade and other traffic going through. But they said food security wasn't an issue. They had cell phones, and we're living relatively decent lives. We're watching South Korean television. But for all of them, they said across the board, in 2023, that shifted. That the risk of watching South Korean TV became too great, which is also part of what led them to make the decision to leave. I want opportunity. I want a future. I can't have that here, so I'm going to go elsewhere. I asked one of them, I was like, oh, well, now you're here in South Korea. What's that opportunity that you want? Like, what do you want to do now that you're here? She's like, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. I just knew that I couldn't have whatever it was if I stayed in North Korea, and I'll figure it out now that I'm here.
So you mentioned Hanwon. I think for the audience, this is a place in South Korea where people who have left North Korea, they come in, and I think they're in Hanwon about 6 months. And they go through things to kind of learn how to use an electronic banking system, kind of how daily life is going to work in South Korea. I was there about 10 years ago, and one of the things that is very obvious when you're at Hanwon is the gender disparity in the defectors that are there. You look at South Korea overall, the number of, the percentages of defectors that are in South Korea is about 70% are women. Next question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the insight provided. And I got a question that's kind of connected with the previous one, is that what is the incentive for the North Korean government to engage in dialogues in human rights or doing any other democratization actions? So what specific incentive do you think they have? Thank you.
That's a good question. You know, I hope that there is a desire on the part of the government, from the people in power, to take care of their people. And I would hope that that is incentive enough. That may be a bit naive to state it that bluntly, but I think the other points of pressure are talking about long-term accountability efforts that could be pursued, and thinking through the other range of tools that the U.S. government has in responding to human rights violations. And those range from visa ineligibilities to financial asset blocking sanctions that are targeted at individuals that are responsible for those human rights abuses, but also working with the international community to pursue other accountability processes.
No, we talked a little bit before about the isolation piece of this. You know, we think a lot about your work in dealing with other countries and dealing with North Korean human rights, trying to create this coalition. How do you then engage potential stakeholders here in the United States. For example, there's a Korean American community, one slice of the Korean American community will blame the State Department for its U.S. travel ban on American citizens going to North Korea as the reason that they cannot then engage with separated families. How do you respond to that, and how do you engage the communities here to share your perspective?
One of the priorities that I have placed on my own strategy or action plan in my first year in the position is to do more outreach, to do listening sessions with the Korean American community, but also just with the broader community of people interested in North Korea. And so I have been focused on meeting with some of those groups, hearing their perspective on things, and thinking through some of the recommendations that they've made. I again, we're in an interesting situation right now because it's kind of one of those, which comes first, the chicken or the egg. The North Koreans don't seem to be moving very quickly to open the door to anyone right now, at least no Americans. There are a couple of other governments that have been able to send their diplomats back, but the South Koreans, the US, and many of the Europeans have still not been able to get back into the country, nor have a lot of the foreign aid providers. And so in terms of long-term approach to this issue, and the US has taken some steps to address some of the concerns that have been raised with us on the special validation passports. We're not trying to make it difficult for people to get there, but we want to make sure that we have made people aware of the risks in traveling to North Korea, and also to mitigate the risks to the greatest extent that we can without restricting people's fundamental freedoms. And then I guess the other thing that I repeatedly go back to is that we are able to have conversations like that. And in the United States, as a government official, I am going out to communities to have these conversations with people. These are things that couldn't happen and don't happen in North Korea.
Question in the back.
Yeah, hi. My name is Christina. I'm a fourth year from the college. You mentioned several times about pre-COVID versus post-COVID responses, or like in your responses, and the increase in surveillance and control by the North Korean government being justified by COVID. Other East Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries also had similar responses to COVID, like using it as a means to justify surveillance, including South Korea and Singapore, so countries that have historically had better relations with the US. So I was wondering how this wider trend in Asia affected the way the US approaches post-COVID human rights violations in North Korea and also in Asia generally.
So I think one distinction in the North Korea environment when we're talking pre and post-COVID is that we're talking pre and post-COVID and that we were countering a global pandemic. But in North Korea, there were a lot of other things that were going on that weren't actually related to COVID. But the timing happens to align with COVID and post-COVID. I think where that leaves us in the North Korea context is, and just to clarify on that front, some of the withdrawal and the repression started right at the same time that COVID did. And so while it gave them an excuse to shut down their borders, to put into place shoot-to-kill orders, and gave them the time to put into place a lot of the restrictive laws, there were a lot of moves that had started being made as early as 2019 because of what they view as a threat from this influx of foreign information, whether it be K-dramas or radio broadcasts or whatever. I think a reason why I like to make that distinction is to also remind people that a lot of the underlying assumptions that we were making about the operating environment in North Korea, about whether or not North Koreans are looking for K-dramas anymore in the marketplace, is something that we should be questioning ourselves. The reports that we're getting from a lot of recent defectors is they're not, because the risk of watching any Korean language content that is not on state media is too high. That Korean language and English language is extremely dangerous right now. And so they've actually reported back to us that Chinese dramas, Russian dramas, or Bollywood movies are increasingly popular right now. And so thinking about it within that context of the changed environment is important.
Can we go back to the cell phone usage? You mentioned this in previous comments. Can you kind of just talk about the existing cell phone network in North Korea? Or so I know there's a domestic version. There's also smuggled versions that come in. How do they get those in? How do they evade tracking in cases where North Korea is looking for people who are using these to communicate with people outside, whether it's in China or in South Korea?
I think that's another area where it's hard to tell right now in a kind of post-COVID environment, because we don't know how many changes were made both to the domestic software and the surveillance technology that's been added to the devices over the course of the last few years, because the flow of information that we were getting out, some of the traditional channels that were moving USB drives in are no longer moving. And so getting information out about what people are using cell phones for is increasingly difficult. I think my understanding is that costs for making cell phone calls back to a family member in North Korea has skyrocketed. And many of those phone calls are calls that are made from an international location, either US, South Korea, wherever the refugee is, to China, and then somebody in China is connecting that to a Chinese cell phone on the North Korean side of the border, and then somebody might be holding the two phones up, side by side, so that you can talk through literally through a Chinese phone into a North Korean phone that might connect them somewhere else. And so this is another thing that I always like to underscore, is the entrepreneurism of North Koreans when it comes to finding creative ways to communicate in an extremely difficult and dangerous environment. Sometimes it's also small video clips that they're passing across from a Chinese SIM card to or a North Korean phone to a phone with a Chinese SIM card that is then making or pushing that information across the cell network to the Chinese side of the border. So there's a lot of creativity. For more information about the actual user base and some of those other facts, there's a lot of great research by groups like 38 North, by the Stimson Center. The Stimson Center just put out a great report on the increase in surveillance technology being used in North Korea. That's definitely worth a look. Some of that surveillance tech should be increasingly alarming for us, especially in the human rights community. One, because it looks increasingly like other surveillance technology that we see being used in some of the more extreme environments in China, like Xinjiang and Tibet and Inner Mongolia, but also surveillance technology that we're seeing elsewhere. I think a lot of that just kind of snuck up on us. And this goes back to the kind of pre versus post. We just weren't seeing as many of the images that we're seeing now in the aftermath. And so there's that kind of gap in our understanding of what the North Koreans were doing at that time when they were pretty much blocked off from the rest of the world.
A question in the back?
Okay. Hello, Ambassador. I'm Andrew Chen. I'm second-year MPP student at a Harris School. My question is regarding the climate change policies in North Korea. Since we know that North Korea has generally poor soil and they have very rugged terrain, so their agriculture output isn't as great, and they had seen records of famine in the past. My question is that what are some of the policies or measures that the North Korean government has taken to combat this issue?
So some of that is a little bit outside of my lane, and so I'm going to be fully transparent that I'm not the climate expert or the environmental efforts or assistance expert as well. But I think this is another area where we've been upfront that we are open to opportunities to sit down at the table with the North Koreans across a range of issues without preconditions. There are a number of groups, including the UN and US-based humanitarian organizations who have in the past done interesting work in the forestry space with the North Korean government to try and address some of those environmental issues. But again, the North Korean government does not appear to be ready to let any of those foreign actors back into the country.
We have a few minutes left. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask the last one unless someone else steps up. We've talked a lot broadly about North Korea, about the international scene. I want to ask, if I can, a little more personal question. And what was North Korea's response to you being appointed? In the past, North Korea has really come after anyone who's appointed to deal with human rights. They've gone after any number of U.S. officials. Were you also subjected to some of that?
Well, when you work in the human rights space, you get used to being called all sorts of names by all sorts of people across governments. So yes, I have they have not disappointed in terms of their name calling. I think when I was originally nominated, they called me a wicked woman of ambiguous origin, which I thought was really inventive, but it improved from there to confrontation envoy. And then most recently, they called me the apostle of aggression.
I have not heard that one.
Yeah, it was quite impressive. And I will say that particular statement was, I can kind of, I take some of that with a little bit of a pride. There's Apostle of Aggression. It's kind of a cool nickname. But they did take some just really misogynistic, unnecessary shots, right? Commenting on my clothes, which, I think there was a statement in that same release about my swooshing skirts, which, as many of my colleagues at the State Department will tell you, I very rarely wear skirts, which was the most amazing part of that statement.
The swooshing skirts they also use for Park Geun-hye as well.
That's right. And so that just seeing that kind of same approach, it never feels good to be called names, but again, on the human rights side of things, usually it means you've caught somebody's attention with what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it doesn't sound like you'll be framing any of those to put them on your wall, but at the same time, when the model is Kim Jong-un, if they're criticizing your clothes, I feel like, you're doing okay. Looks like there are no more questions. I am out of questions. Again, thank you to the International House, the University of Chicago, for putting this together. And finally, thank you to Ambassador Turner.
Thank you.